Okay.
So, David, in your recent juncture essay, you argue that British democracy is going through its worst crisis of confidence in decades. Why is that, and what's wrong with British democracy?
Well, so some of it is deep-seated. It's the result of an economic crisis, which is itself the worst in decades. But some of it is on the surface of political life. It's the scandals. It's the fact that the public institutions, one by one, like dominoes, have been succumbing to these scandals: Parliament, the press, the police, the BBC, everyone bar the monarchy, which says something about British democracy. So it's that combination of the sense that something doesn't work underneath, but that the manifestation of it is mistrust in public institutions and public figures across the board, so that it's hard to know who to turn to regulate the people who have misbehaved. And it's that combination that's so rare, though in the piece I compare it to the 1970s, which was probably the last time where you got that mixture of loss of confidence in public institutions coupled with a deep-seated economic crisis. And I talk about what's the same and what's different.
And one of your arguments is that we've got scandals, but we don't have the crisis has not reached sort of such a point that it would precipitate the sort of reforms necessary to change sort of democratic institutions. And you can say more about that.
Yeah, again, if you compare it to the 1970s, the underlying crisis in the 1970s was probably worse. Britain was it was a less prosperous society, it was a more divided society. There were many more radical political alternatives out there for people to choose between. I mean, democracy was not the only game in town, even in the 1970s. Well, it is now. I mean, there aren't people pushing for alternatives. So this is the system that we've got. And then the crises, the scandals are so fractured. I mean, there's that sense that there isn't a focal point for this. Just when you think that there's a focal point for it, the circus moves on to the next one. So the underlying crisis hasn't got bad enough, and it would be dangerous to wish for a crisis that was bad enough to kind of cut through the scandal and get people to focus on the real stuff, because it's bad, but it's not bad enough. And then the scandals themselves have this kind of scattergun feel to them, where there's just this sort of tick-tick and drip-drip of mistrust in various institutions without a focal point, and that's the dangerous combination.
I mean, what in an ideal world would need to sort of change? What would be the sorts of reforms? I mean, I understand the point that the conditions are not sufficiently sort of bad enough for there to be this change, but I mean, what are the sorts of reforms that would be needed to fix this sort of, as you say, these major institutions in British public life, the banks, the BBC, Parliament, etc., they've all gone through this period where the public confidence in them has collapsed. I mean, how would they be fixed anyway?
Well, part of the problem here is that the institutions that we need to fix them are some of the institutions that have gone through these scandals. So, in a sense, the institutions that you might look to, Parliament or the press, the police, the BBC, whoever it is, the ones that people might look to say we can trust this one to tell us what's wrong with this one, that's not there. So we are looking at some kind of deeper structural change. We're looking at some kind of political change, the kind of political change that probably doesn't come along very often, but it does seem to come along with these deep economic crises roughly every 40 years. I mean, that seems to be the story of the last 3 or 4 cycles of this. From the 70s to now was one period, and that's the thing that's fracturing. From the 30s to the 70s was another period. The real difficulty is knowing in the middle of the fracturing what's going to be the thing that will affect the change, because it's rarely there visible on the surface. It's often surprising. And it takes time, right? It takes 5, 10, 15 years for these changes to work their way through. And we're relatively early on in this. Say we're 5 years into this. The structural crisis, whose visible public symptoms are mistrust and scandal and a sense of disengagement from politics. So the thing that's going to close that gap is not visible now. It could be a politician. It could be an election. It could be a change in the balance of power between the parties and new parties. It could be a change in the relationship between Britain and Europe or within the United Kingdom. I don't think we know, but it's likely over the next 5 years that some of the structural changes that would be necessary, because it's not going to happen just by one institution that people say, this is the last one we trust, the monarchy, the last one we trust, the Queen's going to sort it out. It's going to be structural change. But structural change in the middle of this kind of drawn-out crisis, it's hard to spot the surface agents that are going to bring it about. And that's the difficulty in the middle of it.
And I mean, you mentioned political leadership there. I mean, there's a debate about the extent to which our political leaders today can change the weather, make the sort of political weather. I mean, what do you buy that? Do you look at the sort of current crop of leaders and think, you know, these guys are, you know, have the sort of capacity to sort of affect change?
Well, it's dangerous. So again, if you can compare it to the mid-70s, in the mid-70s exactly the same feeling was out there. Looking across Western democracy, there was this sense that leadership had failed. It had either failed because of scandal, Nixon in the United States, or it had failed because the sense was these were technocrats who didn't have the kind of vision and the capacity to bring about change. Well, by the end of the decade and by the start of the 1980s, change had come about, and it had come about from very unexpected places. In the middle of the decade, you would have got good odds that Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were going to lead the revolution. So you want to be, I think one should always be careful of saying that leadership is now impossible because we look at this crop. It could come from anywhere, but unquestionably it's getting harder, and it's harder now than it was in the 1970s because of fractured attention, because of information technology, because political parties are being hollowed out from the inside, because of the fracturing of the press and of media reporting of politics. It's definitely harder, it's not impossible.
I mean, another thing you say that is different between the 70s and today is, I mean, today you say we live in a post-ideological age. In the 70s there were these ideological alternatives. I mean, is that really true? I mean, some people would say that the different political traditions are trying to reinvent things. You know, we've been nationalising banks. There's, you know, in some sense, the sort of policy options seem more radical now than they did in the sort
so the policy options are more radical, but they're sold to us as technocratic, pragmatic fixes. We're not nationalising the banks in the name of ideology. No one's doing that in the West. They might be doing that Venezuela and other places. You know, there are alternatives out there. You know, the Chinese, the way they run their banking system, the way that Latin American populist Democrats run their banking system is different. But no one in Western democracies like Britain is pushing for those alternatives, and yet the policy options are more radical. So that's a symptom of the gap, in a way, that the rhetoric and the language of political leadership hasn't caught up with the steps that need to be taken to fix what's going on underneath, and the scandals and the lack of trust make it harder and harder. But it still feels to me post-ideological in the sense, I mean, people are trying, Ed Miliband is trying to kind of weave a narrative which doesn't sound too ideological, but has this sort of broader progressive sweep to it that pulls these different policy options together. But I think it's fair to say he hasn't got the narrative together yet, and it is exceptionally hard. I think in these democracies as we have them now, which are in a way hollowed out, where political parties, the mainstream political parties, don't engage with citizens, where there's widespread mistrust, it's very hard to weave a narrative like that. And the absence of radical ideological alternatives makes it harder. In the 70s, at least, there was the sense that there was something scary out there on the left and on the right, keeping the politicians of the centre honest. Now the politicians of the centre are just selling the pragmatic technocratic message and trying to find a narrative to weave around that. And the scandals make it harder, because any narrative that you have tends to get fractured as people lose trust in these institutions.